Jimmy Petruzzi, Salford City Radio 94.4 FM, the Friday Sports Show with your host Jimmy Petruzzi, bringing you all the latest news from the local area and around the world. And we're very fortunate on this show to have some of the world's best athletes, sports people, footballers, and many people associated with sport across different disciplines. And one of the things we've sort of been keen to bring into the show is talk about mental health, and carrying on from the theme of some of the best people in the field of sport who we've been very fortunate to have on the show. We aim to bring people from the field of mental health and psychology to talk about mental health in general, which is also in sport, as we all know, a huge problem, particularly amongst people who do retire at the end of their careers. So, for the listeners, a lot of you may not play or have played professional sport, and we've given insights into people's roles in the game. Today we've got a fascinating insight into mental health. We have a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Liverpool, honorary consultant, clinical psychologist with the Merseycare NHS Trust, clinical advisor for Public Health England, and was the BPS president between 2016. So he's really well placed. You could say a pioneer in the field of the psychology in many ways. Some of the ideas that he's going to bring across I find really, really fascinating, interesting. So Professor Peter Kinderman, welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Hi there, thank you. Yes.
No, great to have you on board, and the latest book that you wrote, I read through, and I've been reading through, and I found with great interest A Manifesto for Mental Health, Why We Need a Revolution. Can you say a bit about the book? I mean, what is your motivation behind writing the book? Yeah.
Sure. So the basic aim of the book is to say we need to change the way that we think about these things that we call mental health problems. So this isn't to trivialize them. In some ways, it's to recognize the seriousness of the problems. Amongst men aged, I think, between 18 and 30, if I've got those figures right, suicide is the most common cause of death, and then road traffic accidents after that. So mental health problems, whatever they are and whatever we call them, are incredibly serious. My point is that we've gone down a bit of a dead end by thinking of them in terms of illnesses. So when we have other health complaints, infections or broken bones or diseases of the body, because we've done quite well in medicine from treating illnesses in this way, I guess it's kind of understandable that we should want to understand our emotional problems as if they're symptoms of or signs of an underlying illness. And then it's kind of tempting to assume that people are depressed or anxious or hear voices or whatever because there's something wrong with them, because there's something wrong with their brains. And then we can even go further and think, well, maybe the reason why people are depressed and the reason why people are anxious and the reason why people hear voices or get paranoid is not only because there's something wrong with them, that there's something wrong with their brains, but it's some sort of genetic condition. And I think that's all really very dangerous. And I'd like us to think of things in much more collective terms. So why we get depressed. And instead of thinking, what's the cause of this illness called depression, which takes us down a biomedical path, I'd like us to think about what keeps us sane, what keeps us happy, what makes us lose the will to live. But think of it in a collective, normalizing, ordinary psychology term. So I don't even think there's a thing called abnormal psychology. I think that we all have emotions, and our brains are involved in controlling how we feel and how we think and how we respond to the world. But I don't really believe in the idea of mental illnesses.
Yeah, it's really interesting in terms of, it's really fascinating points there. And in the book, you spoke about the disease model, and for our listeners, Peter, what is the disease model? I mean, you talk about how. In the book you talked about how we need to examine that, and just for the benefit of our listeners who aren't aware of that and may not be aware of what the disease model focuses on, because you've mentioned the biological path to mental health.
Sure. So I think there are a number of elements to it, and mental health is an area where professionals, academics, commentators, even artists and philosophers debate. So I'm aware that the ideas that I'm putting forward aren't necessarily the only way that people think about things, but this is the approach that I believe is helpful. So what I mean by a disease model of mental health would be that there's a distinction between being well and being ill. so that we have normal mental health. I'm reasonably okay today. I'm not particularly anxious, not particularly depressed, and I don't have any particular paranoid thoughts about my neighbours. And to contrast that within the disease model with having clinical depression, being depressed, or having depression rather, or having a major depressive disorder, which is qualitatively different from the normal ups and downs of everyday life. And I kind of don't think that's true. I think that today I'm pretty happy, tomorrow I might be a little bit depressed, and if it becomes a problem, it becomes a problem. But I'm not sure it cuts into a state at which it becomes an illness. And then, sometimes people, when they're very, very distressed, will maybe hear voices when there's nobody there, or become very paranoid, or become uncontrollably anxious about things. And again, there's the tendency within the disease model, within the illness model, within the medical model, to say that you should treat these things as perfectly normal until they become an illness, and then there's something qualitatively different. And I'm not sure that I think that's helpful.
Yeah, that's really...
The other element is that then what you do is you diagnose disorders. So the cutoff point becomes a medical diagnosis, that there becomes a magical difference between having major depressive disorder and being very depressed. And this moves into the era where medical practitioners do the diagnosing of disorders, and it becomes a very technocratic issue.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You mentioned that, Peter. Something sort of come to mind when you spoke about the diagnosis, which is something that's I'd like to speak to you in more detail and just for the benefit of our listeners. And I was just thinking about I think it was the Rosenhan experiment, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
The guys that sort of, I don't remember how, when it was seven researchers had gone to different, I'll stand corrected, psychiatric hospitals and got admitted in the 70s with I think 6 of them got admitted with schizophrenia. I stand corrected the research anyway. But is that something that sort of research that might have influenced your outlook to a point where obviously it was that sort of research can sort of question the validity of psychiatric diagnosis, in the sense that you're relying on someone's expertise to do that, but what's your take on the diagnosis, the diagnostic criteria in that sense?
Yeah, so the Rosenhan experiment is really interesting. It's also in some ways, it's quite controversial. So in recent months, in fact, some researchers have suggested that maybe Rosenhan himself wasn't necessarily as entirely straightforward as he might have been about some of that data. So the Rosenhan experiment was interesting because what he reported was that he and his research students presented themselves to mental health professionals just saying that they heard a disembodied voice saying thud, and that they all got admitted to hospital and treated with psychiatric drugs and diagnosed with various disorders. And his original paper was about being sane in insane places. And the idea was that essentially that people couldn't really tell the difference between sanity and insanity. Now, I think there are still several. I agree there are some worrying aspects about the Rosenhan experiment, but I think that there are some other experiment studies, lessons from history about diagnosis that are equally worrying. So, one of the things that happens with psychiatric diagnoses is that within the medical model of mental illnesses, we're fine unless we have a mental illness, and the mental illnesses are put forward as having some sort of reality outside of subjective opinion. But it wasn't until 1973 that the American Psychiatric Association decided to remove homosexuality from its list of mental disorders. And actually, when it did that, there was a vote, and a bit like Brexit, the vote was that 52% of American psychiatrists agreed that they should no longer regard loving somebody of the same gender as an illness, and 48% thought that it should still stay on the books. So the idea that because the list of disorders that we now have include such things as clinical depression or obsessive compulsive disorder, that therefore they are clearly and unambiguously valid. No, they're voted in and voted out of existence because it suits people. A different example would be post-traumatic stress disorder, which was introduced in order to help deal with the obviously traumatized veterans returning from the Vietnam War. The psychiatric profession didn't really have a way of dealing with that trauma, and so they developed a new form of terminology in order to deal with it. Now, my point would be, the soldiers caught up in the Vietnam War were undoubtedly traumatized by that experience. And I think that in that sense there exists a phenomenon called post-traumatic stress. Whether or not we should think of that as post-traumatic stress disorder is, I think, a completely different idea. So the idea for me is that we do get depressed, we do get anxious, we do get traumatized, but the idea that these are medical illnesses that can be diagnosed and then treated, because we happen to have put these names into what we currently constitute to be our diagnostic framework, no, all of that is debatable. And I think by the time that we do diagnose these illnesses, it's already taken us down quite a dangerous route in terms of how we think and then what we do to help people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's really interesting stuff. And I think, obviously, sort of going back to say, schizophrenia from a social point of view. If we look sort of from a social point of view, theories like the double blind theory sort of come to mind, where I think was Bass and his colleagues in the 50s. Talked about how the double blinds can be used as a way of coercion and that sort of maintain the homeostatic balance of schizophrenia in sort of family environments. But equally in the 50s, you had like the antipsychotic as well. So from a biological point of view, but for the general person, Peter, it must be a minefield, because they don't quite understand how conclusions are drawn to diagnostic. But on the other side of things, what would you say in terms of diagnostic criteria? If someone has a label, it gets the person maybe the help that they need, they might not have got. So is there sort of a case for that, maybe having obviously in America, insurance is a big player as well in terms of their health system. But would you say in terms of giving a label is perhaps maybe useful for the person getting maybe the help that they need?
I think that's a very good point. So if we are suffering as a result of all the things that happen to us, then we absolutely need help. And it is clearly the case that the way that the mental health care system works at the moment is it's hugely dependent on this diagnostic process. So it is true that if you want to see a therapist, or if you want to try taking antidepressant medication, although personally I advise a little bit of caution before doing that, but if that's what you need, then because the diagnostic system exists and because the medical model is so dominant in our healthcare system, yes, it's true that people will expect you to go through that route, and that in itself brings problems. So my two arguments would be, I think that's really worrying, and we absolutely don't need to do that if we change the system. So I'm not calling for ignoring the fact that GPs and psychiatrists use diagnoses. I'm not suggesting that we should pretend that the Department for Work and Pensions don't depend on diagnostic frameworks for making decisions. What I'm saying is that they should change. I think there should be a revolution in the way that we do things. So at the moment, if you want to go and see a therapist because you're having problems in your personal life, you need more or less to accept that there's something wrong with you. You need to accept that you've got a mental illness, and you know what? You're not permitted to apply for a visa to enter the United States of America if you've had a mental illness. So technically, if you want to have some counselling, you're putting yourself in a position where you can't apply under the visa waiver scheme to enter the United States of America. And just think, what about employers?
Absolutely.
I had a case where I saw a young man who had been effectively suspended from his job in a form of public service because there was a suspicion as to whether he had been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in his childhood, and then had not told his employers about it. So there are real dangers with it. The other danger, of course, is that because we think of these things as illnesses, once you start saying, instead of saying, I'm very depressed, say, I have an illness called clinical depression, it's listed by the World Health Organization as major depressive disorder, there are a whole swathe of assumptions that come. There must be something wrong with you. I wonder what's happening to your chemical imbalance, what's happening to your serotonin system, is it genetic, does it run in families, etc., 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 and are you taking your medication? One of the things I'm doing as part of the lockdown with coronavirus is revisiting box sets of Homeland. And of course the theme through that is, oh my God, what if this CIA agent stops taking her medications? She will go Loopy Tunes again because the medication puts right an abnormality of the brain, that etc., etc., etc. So all of these things follow from that, when actually what you want is to walk into your GP clinic and say, you know what, I'd really like to see a therapist, and your GP to go, okay then, I'll make the referral. There's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't be able to do that, and that's what I'm calling for. So I'm not saying that people can't get services, I'm saying that in the present system, we're too reliant on the use of diagnostic frameworks in order to get people access to those services.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point, and I think that, certainly I think that that will sort of change and like you said, revolutionise the way things are done at the moment. One thing that I sort of was thinking about when I was reading the book was, say, for example, people have got, say, organic disorders. So, for example, someone who suffers from anxiety, but it might be a thyroid issue, someone who's got, say, comorbidity from maybe a tumour. Or, I mean, I'm not a medical person by no stretch of the imagination, but I just think for me, Peter, there might be more. I could be completely wrong, and you've got a vast amount of experience, but I just think from a biological point of view, sometimes certain things, it'd be useful to maybe be quick on maybe ruling things out that it could be from that point of view. I mean, you mentioned depression in that respect, but that can also be a number of medical conditions can have that. For example, like, not that I'm a medical expert, but say someone's got celiac disease, then that may have an influence on their mood as well. And in terms of the model itself, I mean, going forward, is it still important that maybe the biological factors, that they're screened in a way where, okay, everyone's sort of working together at helping the person have the best quality of life available to them?
Yeah, so I think there's something really important but kind of complex in what you're saying. So you mentioned celiac disease or thyroid problems and so forth, and that's really important. So I know, not only because I'm a clinical psychologist, but just I've been around the world for 54 years, right, that there are lots of things I can do that can affect my mental state. If I drink alcohol or smoke marijuana or whatever, it will affect my mental state. If I became seriously ill and became delirious, this would be biological factors affecting my mental state. And there are lots and lots and lots and lots of medical problems that will have consequences for our mental health. So the most obvious, probably the most common, would be anemia, especially in women for all sorts of reasons. If you become anemic, you will feel tired, and I mean, I think there's a really interesting research question as to whether the fatigue that comes along because you're anemic is then picked up by yourself and sort of reinterpreted as a form of depression or lethargy and so forth, or whether the two experiences are somewhat different in some way. But that doesn't really matter. The point is, we know that if you have anemia, then it's highly likely that one of the consequences may well be that you will then experience low mood. Mm-hmm. So we know, and I'm completely, I have no doubt whatsoever that biological factors, physiological factors, can lead to emotional, behavioural, mental health problems. But that's not the same as saying, in fact, it's actually almost the opposite of saying major depressive disorder is a biological illness. And it's kind of there in the question, which is having an underactive thyroid or having anemia, those are the illnesses, right? Mm-hmm. So hyperthyroidism or anemia are recognised medical conditions.
Yes.
And one of the symptoms of them, one of the consequences of those conditions, is depression.
Mm-hmm.
That's almost exactly the opposite of saying that depression is itself an illness, with low mood being a symptom of that illness called depression. What it's actually saying is depression is a common symptom of other illnesses. So you're not diagnosing depression, you're diagnosing poor, underactive thyroid. You're
Absolutely.
not diagnosing major depressive disorder, you're diagnosing anemia. What you're left with is, well, you haven't got an underactive thyroid, thank God for that. You're not anemic, thank God for that. In fact, I can't find any biological reason why you're depressed.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start to explore why you might be depressed. Good. Let's do that then. But then to assume that I haven't found any medical cause for your depression, but it's still a medical illness, that doesn't make any sense to me at all. The only possible way you could sustain that is to say, in those individuals for whom we've eliminated the known biological illnesses that could have depression as a symptom, once we've eliminated all of those, there is an underlying biological condition which we have not yet found, which explains depression. And then I would come in and say, for God's sake, why don't you just ask the poor guy why he's depressed? He'll probably bloody tell you.
Absolutely.
And then we can start working on it.
No, absolutely. That's really interesting stuff. And I mean, what I find interesting on the topic of depression, Peter, is that for me, there's people who are, obviously you've got the treatment resistant people who, no matter what they do, they struggle. And there's people who, like, for example, they might be sub-threshold, they don't get the diagnosis, but they've got like constructs of depression that can be debilitating as well.
Yes.
And then somewhere in between. And for me, that sort of suggests there could be a number of pathways. It could be a chemical thing, it could be thought process, it could be inflammation of the brain. And I mean, I was having a conversation with someone the other day. You mentioned that the lockdown and that talked about how it's going to have an impact on people, and no doubt it will. And I'm not really well placed to comment on that, but I also said it could be another thing where recent findings have showed that inflammation of the brain, that the blood-brain barrier, if it gets permeated, could cause problems too. So from a biological point of view, there might be things that we're still not sure about that are hard to examine. And I mean, some of the biomarkers, they're being used in research, they're not being used in diagnostic. And do you see a time when maybe we're able to use the modern equipment that we have in helping with diagnostic, or is that sort of too far away from where we are?
Well, so again, I think you're still clinging on to the idea, which is plausible, but I don't necessarily buy, that this is a diagnostic thing. So if we look at, for instance, the inflammation stuff that you were talking about, so the idea that inflammatory processes in the brain may well be associated with the experience of depression. This is stuff coming out of Cambridge, out of a guy called Ed Bullmore, who's a professor of psychiatry there. I think it's really quite convincing argument. Yeah. But here's the thing. So let's think about conceptually what it is that we're talking about. So I don't think this is a case of saying that there exists an illness called major depressive disorder, a clinical phenomenon called depression, which is caused by biological abnormalities in our inflammatory system. I think it's simpler than that, which is if you are exposed to stressful life events, you will experience the stress of losing your job in all of the facets of what it is to be human. So you will lose your job and you will think bad thoughts. You will lose your job and you will feel exhausted. You will feel deflated. You'll lose your job and you will experience periods of sadness and have hopeless and pointless thoughts about the future. And because you're a biological creature, it is inconceivable that those experiences won't be reflected in the functioning of your brain. So let's say that we got a huge and sophisticated machine that could take somebody, put them into a magnetic resonance imaging machine, and they volunteer for it, and you go, okay, out of the 100 employees in this factory, 50 of you are going to be laid off, but we're only going to tell you whether you've been sacked or not in the fMRI machine. It's almost certain in my mind that if you were to do that, you would show biological processes happening in the brain at the moment that the poor bugger realizes he's been sacked. I think that what will happen is there'll be physiological changes that will exactly parallel feeling, what's the point anymore? Some people will be angry, most people will be deflated, and particularly your thoughts will start racing to all the things that your thoughts would race to when you've been told such terrible news.
Of
Now,
course.
is it possible that as part of that system, inflammation is part of the messaging system that conveys the news that something terrible is happening to you? I think it's almost inevitable that that is true.
Yeah, I think really interesting.
But I don't think that's inflammation causes depression. I think that the brain uses inflammatory processes as part of its information processing system. Now, I think that that's really interesting and valuable. It might even be useful in terms of thinking that, if you wanted to cheer somebody up, maybe as well as ketamine and Prozac and cocaine and alcohol and all the other chemicals that affect our mood, maybe chemicals that will affect inflammatory processes will affect our mood. I wouldn't be terribly surprised, but I don't think it's an illness. I think that's about how the brain processes information and how processes of inflammation are part of that system.
Yes, that's really interesting stuff. So, just in terms of our listeners, that for me sort of highlights a sort of gene environment interaction. So, you mentioned there, so that the job loss, or if it's an adverse event that can trigger something off, and I suppose the listeners are wondering, well, why does one person end up going into cascade of depression or something along those lines, and one doesn't? And do you see sort of genes playing the gene environment, the nature-nurture debate being salient now? Look, we've got these genes and we've got the environment. Do you see genetic factors as being a big influence in it as well, Peter?
Well, I think it's interesting that you used the word big influence. So I think that genetic factors play an influence in a couple of ways, but not a big influence. And the way that it works is this. So the first thing to say is we are all biological creatures. So, and that's a truism, but it's true. And our brains have developed because of the influence of genes with the environment. So my most basic premise is that when people get depressed, they get depressed because as they look at the world, it seems a depressing place. And if the world seems a depressing place, you will get depressed. The question then is, why has that person come to the conclusion that the world is a depressing place? Step one, because they've got a working brain. Step two, because it really is. So what we know is that when people report low mood, chances are they will have experienced a series of negative life events before reporting depression. So negative life events involving loss, involving disappointment, are extremely strongly associated with the occurrence of depression. When we say that, what almost always happens is somebody puts their hand up and says, but hang on, Peter, if you get 50 people laid off in a factory, not all of those 50 people will get depressed. So there must be something that separates out those who get depressed following a negative life event and those who don't. Could it be differences in their genetics? Oh, and by the way, of the 50 people who haven't been laid off, some of them get depressed anyway. So sure. Negative life events are depressing, but some people get more depressed than others in response to the same negative life event. And for some people, it doesn't seem to take much to trigger off depression anyway. Is that not because they differ in some sort of genetic vulnerability to depression? To which the answer is, well, we've run the science on that, and we've yet to find any genetic differences that explain more than a trivial amount of the difference. But what we do know is that there are huge differences between people which do explain that difference. And again, they're common sense, but we often forget about them. So people who come from socially disadvantaged backgrounds tend to be more hard hit by negative life events. Why? Because, I'm really quite well off. And if my boss told me that I had to take a 25% pay cut because the economy is tanking after coronavirus, I'd be a bit pissed off, but it wouldn't lead me to contemplate taking my own life.
Of course.
If I was already on the breadline and I got a 25% pay cut, it would be profoundly depressing, and I might start to develop some very negative thoughts indeed. If I'd been abused as a child, and my basic mindset is the world's a pretty bloody awful place, and I'm just about hanging together, and then I get laid off, then I may well have more negative thoughts about that event than somebody who's been really rather well treated all their life, where they know that they're loved, they know that they're respected, and their response will be to go home and think, okay, well, this is a challenge, but the world's basically a good place. I'm okay. Let's regroup and carry on. Now, you're much more likely to have those sorts of positive thoughts if you've had lots of positive experiences in your life, especially in childhood, and much less likely to have those positive thoughts if you've had negative experiences in your childhood. And so you get a potentiation in scientific terms between people who've had negative experiences in their childhood and later on life events. So you can explain why two people being faced with the same life events may well have different mental health outcomes without falling on the idea that the really big issue is genetic differences. And to sum it all up, I think there are genetic differences between people, but they're probably not terribly important.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I suppose, that sort of reflecting on that, the sort of monozygotic twin, the identical twin studies as well, where, say, one twin has an adverse event that sort of, tips them over the edge into depression, and one doesn't as well. So,
yeah. And what you find in those sorts of experiments is that quite often there's quite a lot of overlap between monozygotic twins, but it's not perfect. Yeah. And that tells us kind of what we already know, which is when it comes to our mental health, very few things are absolutely 100% defined. So, genetic differences between people. So let's literally take you and me. If both you and I, we went on a trip to Hull, and in Hull, as we got off the train, we were both mugged. So we both had some terrible negative experience happen to us. It might be the case that I find that really traumatic and you don't.
Yeah.
So we've got to explain why you're resilient and I'm vulnerable. Well, I think that the fact that I might have some dodgy genes could conceivably possibly explain some of the difference, but we've got loads of other much, much more impressive candidate variables that we could look at instead. So I would look at the way that we've been brought up, the expectation, the social class that we come from, gender, the experiences we've had in life, what we've learned both in childhood and adolescent about the way the world works. And I'd start to look at those things rather than immediately assume that the reason why I found it traumatic and you didn't was because there's something different in our genes.
Yeah, that's really powerful stuff, Peter. It certainly highlights a strong rationale for why we do need a revolution in healthcare. In terms of sort of going forward, what would be your sort of vision in terms of, obviously, the book's really interesting, and I'd suggest anyone have a read, do have a read and see what you think, and it's really powerful stuff. But what would be your vision? How would things be different if the revolution happened, Peter? Where would it be? Say tomorrow morning that the revolution sort of happened. Where would we be different to where we are today?
So the first thing that I would say is, well, I suppose the first thing I'd want to say is I'd quite like for us collectively to change our understanding of what these things mean. So I would like us kind of all, in this revolution, a revolutionary change would be for us all to think less in terms of mental illnesses and more in terms of just psychological phenomena. And that would lead on to a change in language. So instead of people having a disorder of depression or being diagnosed with depression, I would like people to talk about experiencing depression, being depressed. So to talk about these things not as illnesses, but to talk about these things as experiences. I think what I would then want is to say, how do we respond to people who are particularly distressed by these sorts of experiences? What would we want to do in the way of mental health services when people get depressed? And what I would say there is what I would want us to do, what I would want GPs or social workers or employers or teachers or even priests to do is to recognise when people are depressed and to offer people help. One of the things that I point out in the book is that the World Health Organization already recognises this. So, listed in the World Health Organization's diagnostic manual are disorders like post-traumatic stress and major depressive disorder and schizophrenia. But they also list hearing voices, anger, low mood, harming yourself. So I think we should focus on those actual experiences. So, in a sense, I think that I should go to my GP and say, could you help me, please? I am depressed. And my GP should go, sure, I'll get you some services. What would you like? I should, if the need arose, go to my GP and say, I'm hearing voices, or I've started cutting myself, and then just get services. I don't think I should be given a diagnosis of an illness in order to get services. And then I think what follows from that is, instead of looking for biological explanations for why there's something wrong with my brain and why I have to take drugs, I think we should look for practical solutions. And although I am a psychotherapist, I think we should look for practical solutions even before we do psychotherapy. Just a very, very quick story. So last year I set some students a little homework assignment, and they had to come up with a very simple but a clinical psychologist's formulation of why their client might have become depressed. And I gave them a little vignette, a little story about somebody who got depressed, and I'd said that his business was failing, and he went to his GP because he'd started to take his troubles home with him, and they'd got a difficulty with his wife, and things were falling about, and he wanted help. And I was listening to my students presenting their I suppose kind of like caricatures really of what a psychologist would do to understand. And I realised that they were focusing on his negative thoughts. And not one of them, including me, had said, get him a business loan.
Absolutely.
Get him some help for his business, so that his business wouldn't fail, so he wouldn't become depressed. So I think before we prescribe people with drugs, we should try therapy. Before we try therapy, we should try solutions, and those solutions should be practical and social. And I think just to bring it up to date with coronavirus, it's pretty shit, right? But it's not shit because lots of people will develop mental illnesses. It's because the government needs to do practical things to keep us safe. So I think we need to focus on the practical issues that are leading people to have problems before we think about personal solutions like psychotherapy or any form of personal therapy. But then I think we should go for personal therapy before we think about taking medication.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I suppose in saying that too, Peter, it's like in one sense the level of intrusiveness in terms of the intervention too comes into it too. And whilst I'm not advocating, I'm not in a position to sort of say what people do and that sort of stuff. But obviously, the level of intrusiveness in terms of taking, I think it's one shouldn't take these things lightly. I think that's for sure. And speaking to someone can be a useful thing too. So psychosocial strategy are really imperative in one sense, but the pharmaceutical probably won't work for everybody, but equally they do work for some too. So I suppose in saying that, sort of getting that balance is key. But you made a really interesting point there, where you sort of talked about, say, for example, exploring the thoughts and the negative thought patterns when actually it's just a social problem the person might have, where they've been made redundant and also they're struggling for money. So that could be a big factor.
Well, and just to go back, one step, you were saying about medication being potentially helpful for people, and you're right, medication can be helpful for people. And personally, I think that we use medication much too liberally, much too often, much too quickly, and so forth. But I think the medication can be helpful. My main problem with medication is that the drugs are put forward as cures for illnesses rather than temporary chemical solutions to problems. So if you went down the pub and you said, I haven't seen you for a while, how are things? And your mate goes, I've been really, really depressed. And Fred around the corner suggested that ketamine is really helpful. I found it really really perked myself up. You go, shit, I can understand why you do that, but seriously, that's not the solution. Get yourself sorted out. The person goes around the pub and goes, I've been really, really depressed. The doctor has prescribed me sertraline, and people go, oh, good, because that's a cure for the illness. And I think there's some profound errors of reasoning going on there that I'm really quite worried about.
That's a powerful point. I think so too. And like, it's a really powerful insight. And I suppose in terms of the ideas that you have, Peter, there's a number barriers there in one sense, and I guess different people have different ideas of what the barriers are. But in your experience of sort of working in this field for so many years and being one of the leading experts in the field, is it okay to ask you what you think some of the barriers might be? This makes a lot of sense. Obviously, there's a lot of great points you make. The book, you read it, there's a lot of sense. You think, well, why aren't we sort of adopting this approach? Is it finance? Is it learning about? Is it what are some of the key barriers to sort of to help people getting the best care that they need?
I think that there are lots of things in life, lots of just issues that we come across with our friends, with employers, with colleagues, with our kids, where people go, what's going on here? And you give an answer and you go, oh, it's like this. And we very rarely go, why did you say that? What's your assumptions behind that? How does it work? So if I was to say to you, what's the best route to get from here to Birmingham, and we start talking about the M4 and the M40, you kind of go, well, he's a guy who knows what he's talking about, so I'll take it on trust. If what happens in the media, when the BBC start talking about a footballer who's suffering from bipolar disorder, for instance, the language tells us, we just know this is the way to think about these things. There's no question about it. There are things like bipolar disorder. And it's not until you start questioning the assumptions that I think we should start to go, hang on a minute, that's not necessarily, that's an assumption rather than a fact. The idea that there are things called mental illnesses that come about basically because people have things going wrong with their brains, they can be diagnosed and then treated, is just imbued in our culture. It's just there. So I think the first thing is we believe it in the same way that we know that there's a difference between a cycle path and a motorway. No, we rarely have to sit down and work out the logic of it from scratch. We just accept it. And I think there are reasons why this happens. So I think that back in the sort of 17th, 18th century, biological medicine, when it started to understand things like germ theory and the circulation of the blood in the body and the way that the skeleton articulated, doctors became really, really good at explaining and then helping us with things. So we really do know what strokes are, and we really do know how heart disease works, and we really do know what viral infections are, and we're really good at responding to them. And it makes sense to then translate from ailments of the physical body to ailments of the mind and ailments of the brain. It's not a stupid thing to do. So it was a logical step, and then things followed. But then you get various other things that happen. So philosophers like Michel Foucault and Thomas Saz and R.D. Laing started thinking about, how is it that we're dealing as a society with those people who have problems that we don't really want to think about too much. We can shuffle these problems off elsewhere. So instead of dealing with poverty and abuse of children and the victimization of women, we just talk about personality disorder. Instead of thinking about how some people in society can be marginalized and even vilified, and thinking about the injustice meted out to people who are in the most vulnerable groups in society, we diagnose people with illnesses.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that there are processes that have gone on which have been unhelpful in this process. You've then got the issue of professional roles. So not only psychiatrists, but also psychologists, clinical psychologists do very well out of the mental illness industry. I can charge you money to treat an illness with my cognitive behavior therapy, and I'll charge you a lot of money, and I'll produce a lot of evidence to suggest that you really do have an illness, and only I can treat it with my fangled technology. So there's a professional interest in it. And of course the pharmaceutical companies make billions of pounds selling us drugs in order to either change our mood or treat illnesses depending on how you want it. I mean, the drinks industry, the alcohol industry is pretty expensive, and their vested interest is telling us that it's kind of okay, you can handle it, it's not going to do you too much harm, keep it within limits and it's fine. The illegal drugs industry is illegal, but the legal pharmaceutical industry is basically predicated on the idea of some of us from time to time will develop mental illnesses for which these chemicals can help. And so we buy into all of this myth. And I think all of these pressures move us in that direction. And then finally, and probably the most pernicious, is it's kind of useful for us too. So it's useful for employers because as an employer, I can distinguish between giving time off to people who are sick and not if they're not sick. It absolves me of some really quite complicated decisions. And for me as an individual, if I become depressed, I go off to the doctor, I tell my doctor my problems, and I get a prescription. And all of that's quite helpful. I don't think it's the right way to go, but you can see why they're all luring us in this direction.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and I think that there's some really powerful points there. Peter, so refreshingly, honest in terms of the way you spoke about that, and the field that you're in as well. And in my opinion, certainly people aren't always that way. Professionals, sometimes there's a bias to what they do, and that may be intentional, unintentional. But certainly from what you're saying there, one thing that sort of sticks to mind is that sort of almost like a reductionist. Sometimes this is sort of the way I sort of see it, and based on sort of hearing and reading about what professionals like yourself write and other people out there. I suppose the system in one sense is almost still has that reductionist attitude where, say for example in the medical field, if someone say has an infection and have an antibiotic and sort of rightly so, and I don't want to obviously not a medical person, but you can see that sometimes you're not thinking in mental health that's the case too, where things can be a bit reductionistic and just put down to one thing. And
so one of the areas where I worry a lot is with children. So I mean I have serious concerns about the way in which children are diagnosed, especially with so-called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That bothers me a great deal. And I'm not saying that I'm certainly not saying that kids don't have problems, and I'm not saying that the problems that kids have that their parents recognise aren't genuine problems that really need very serious attention. I think they are really serious problems, and I think they really do need serious attention. But if you've got a kid who is at school, who seems to find it impossible or is unable, maybe unwilling, but certainly cannot pay attention, is disruptive, is causing problems to other kids, is possibly even aggressive, certainly very difficult to maintain discipline in the classroom, and that child is both not learning, which is bad for the child, but you can see in terms of the way in which the child is behaving that he or she is on a path which is not going to do them any good in life. Absolutely. But I would rather ask, why is that happening and what can we do about it, than what illness do they have and how can we treat it? Yeah. So what are the root causes of this child's difficulties, and is there an educational or behavioural or psychological or social intervention that we can put in to change things? So one of the things, just to say, before people kind of go, well, yeah, but we've tried all that and it doesn't work, just be cautious. So with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, there's obviously huge interest in trying to develop research programs that can point to biological causes of the presumed illness, the ADHD illness, right? When we look at the data, when it comes to biological factors, it's very confusing. Findings are published one year and then they're not replicated the next year. Doesn't really make sense, and you can come up with variables that would explain any differences that you find between groups of children, for instance. What is consistent is two findings. The first is that the youngest child in a cohort, in a class, in a school, is most likely to get diagnosed with ADHD. Mm-hmm. And if you think about kids entering school at 5 years old, you've got a kid whose birthday is at the very end of the academic year, sitting on the same table as a kid whose birthday is right at the beginning of the academic year, and they both start school on the same day. Then one kid is nearly 364 days older than the other kid. They're in the same class and they're only 5 years old. That's like a 20% difference in cognitive development right there. Mm-hmm. And if you think about kids learning to speak at the age of 2, for one kid, they've got between the time that they learn to speak, they've maybe got 2 years of cognitive development. The other kid's got 3 years of cognitive development, and then they both go to school and they're exposed to the same education. We could expect them to be different in terms of the way in which they respond to lessons. And of course, that's precisely what we find. What we find is that the youngest kids in a cohort are much more likely, statistically significantly more likely, to receive a diagnosis of ADHD, and therefore more likely to have problems maintaining attention, focusing on task, getting the work done and so forth, controlling their emotions. The other thing we find is that kids from socially deprived backgrounds, again, get the diagnosis of ADHD. And again, why would kids from socially deprived backgrounds find it difficult to pay attention in class, focus on lessons and so forth? Well, it's kind of there in the question, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So when we get these messages, we're going, John is having real difficulties at school, let's look inside his brain. And I'd really much prefer we go, John is having real difficulties at school, let's mobilise the resources of the village to try to find out whether we can come up with an educational solution that can improve his chances of thriving at school.
Yeah, and absolutely. That's a great point, Peter. Certainly many years ago when I used to work in education, in sort of care homes and in that area, and certainly when ADHD sort of come up, and I'm not suggesting that they do it or don't take medication, it's obviously part of their care plan, but I certainly think in certain situations that the attachment disorder that the young person had through, a lot of them had a very challenging upbringing and was sort of moved from home to home, and sometimes you think, well, how much of that has been taken into consideration in terms of their destabilized behavior, really, and I just thought, in my opinion, there were times that, perhaps that staff just that with all the will in the world, that just didn't have the clinical knowledge to equip to help the young people.
I mean, let's take just the final element of that. So let's say that you're a head teacher in a school, and you're visited by somebody who's saying, this kid here seems to be having real trouble in class, and you go, oh so we're having real worries about this kid. They're quite concerned about his development. He finds it difficult to do this, that, and the other. And they go, oh right, okay, have you investigated? And go, well, yes, we've investigated. And of course, one of the things you need to know about John is that because of really traumatic things that have happened in his childhood, he's got a range of disabilities, including, we think, possibly that there's been some developmental problems in his childhood that have affected the development of his brain. And those disabilities add to his challenges in paying attention in class. You'd go, absolutely. What you're telling me is that there's a biological factor which might affect the experiences that are clustered under the diagnostic criteria for attention deficit disorder. Mm-hmm. No shit, Sherlock.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
But it isn't a bloody illness. It's the biological factors that affect the development of a kid's brain might impact on their ability to pay attention. I mean, for God's sake, it's not rocket science.
Absolutely.
So then you go, should we invoke some sort of a formulation of the kids' problems that include an appreciation of biological factors? We damn well should. That's not the same as diagnosing them with ADHD and giving them Ritalin.
Absolutely, yeah, and what goes with, I mean, this medication, obviously, like you said there, I think that the sort of weighing everything up and sort of, being holistic and giving the person the best chance to have the best life possible, really.
Yes.
And so I've seen the effects firsthand of some of the young people. Not advocating they do it, I don't take it. That's a case for the system that they're in. But equally in saying that, I had seen situations where the young person just sort of got out and became socially interactive and engaged and behaved completely different in different social environments too, providing the stability.
Yeah. And you say, I mean, I think I don't want to get this wrong in the sense that I don't want to give people the impression, for instance, that I don't think that biological factors impact on the human brain and therefore can be involved in the sort of experiences that we're talking about. Of course they can, but I don't think they're illnesses. So, going back to an earlier thread in this conversation, is it possible that problems with thyroid functioning could make somebody depressed? Yes, but they're not the cause of a disorder called major depressive disorder. they're a consequence of thyroid problems. Is it possible that when you're anemic, you could become very depressed? Absolutely. I think that's very common. But that doesn't mean that there's a disorder called major depressive disorder for which anemia is one of the causal factors. No, it means that one of the symptoms of anemia, one of the consequences of anemia, is sometimes low mood. Is it true that when you take certain recreational drugs, you'll have hallucinations? Absolutely, it's true, because drugs that affect dopaminergic systems can lead to hallucinations. Does that mean, therefore, that there's a disorder called schizophrenia, which is a disorder of the biological dopamine systems? No. It means that there are many pathways to why people might hear voices, and disruption of the dopamine system is one of them. But I don't think that finding that the brain is a biological organ that can be affected by biological factors necessarily follows that the listed illnesses in the diagnostic manuals are real in any sense, or follow from dysfunctions of the brain that need to be corrected with medication. I simply don't think those conclusions follow.
That's really powerful stuff, and I really want to thank you, Peter, for coming on board the show. It's been fascinating, and sort of time is sort of getting the best of us, and it's been a really powerful insight for our listeners, and I certainly suggest that they get a read of A Manifesto for Mental Health, Why We Need a Revolution in Healthcare. What a privilege it's been to have you on the show, and to have someone of Professor Peter Kinderman's stature to come on board the show. I'm sure our listeners have really been a real eye-opening experience for them on Salford City Radio 94.4 FM. Professor Peter Kinderman being really kind enough to sort of join us on the show, and the conversation flowed, and there's so much information to take on board, and certainly a lot of the things that you talk about are really, really thought-provoking. So